for joining us today for this podcast, which is a mini series of our Eyes on Washington podcast. And we're doing these on the upcoming election. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Liz Craddock. I'm a partner here at Holland Knight. I've been here for a couple of years, but have worked in Washington, D.C., on Capitol Hill and downtown for over 2 decades now. I work for Senator Mary Landrieu of Louisiana, handling all things energy policy related, including getting to serve as her staff director of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. So have a lot of backgrounds in oil and gas policy here in Washington, D.C. I'm joined by my colleague, Jim Noe, who's also a partner here at Holland Knight. Jim, you want to give a little intro about yourself?
Sure, Liz. Thanks for that. I'm a partner here in the Washington office of Holland Knight. Prior to joining Holland Knight, I spent about 20 years in the oil and gas industry, mostly with oil and gas companies focused on offshore waters and public lands, and also internationally.
Great. Thanks, Jim. It's been fun getting to work with Jim over the years. We actually first met when I was working for the senator during Deepwater Horizon. So a lot of oil and gas issues between the two of us over the years. So it's been fun. Well, today we wanted to talk about the Democratic ticket now that the Democratic National Convention is over and VP Harris is the official Democratic candidate for president. So Jim and I wanted to provide a little intro about what the oil and gas industry might expect to see from a potential Harris administration. So with that, Jim, what do we know about VP Harris and her positions as they relate to oil and gas?
Well, Liz, to show my Generation X bona fides, I think, the first question we need to begin with what Vice President Harris may do in the White House with respect to oil and gas is to ask, will the real Kamala Harris please stand up on oil and gas issues? We've heard quite a number of different positions from Kamala Harris over the years, dating back to her time as a presidential candidate in the last cycle. In 2019, then candidate Harris was really running to the left of her future boss, President Biden, on a number of climate issues, including oil and gas issues. She was, famously a co-sponsor of the original Green New Deal. She was very aggressive in her role as the Attorney General of the state of California in suing oil and gas companies on a host of issues, including on climate change, on environmental justice issues. She is, through her career, both in the state government of California and then in the Senate, and then, as a candidate for president in 2019, she's supported a ban on fracking, which she's subsequently reversed course on, which we'll talk about in a moment. She's called for $1 trillion funding for climate, which is, vastly larger than what the Biden administration has pushed in its climate objectives. She's stated things like wanting to ban new drilling on public lands and waters. And yet, the candidate that we see today and coming out of the DNC last week is much more practical and moderate. She's reversed her stance on fracking. I mean, I think we would all, there's some political drivers to that, with Pennsylvania being, an absolute must-win state for, a Harris ticket, and, Pennsylvania being a very large natural gas producer. We've seen her moderate her stance on that. So I think in many respects, we're waiting for, the real Kamala Harris with respect to oil and gas to stand up and make herself known. So there's a lot of uncertainty that hopefully will become a little more clear in the coming days as we see a presidential debate, as we see candidate Harris take more unscripted interviews, et cetera.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, Jim, though, we don't know exactly what we think, Harris will do when it relates to oil and gas, but we do think we have enough tea leaves sort of reading off of what the Biden administration has done. So we do, I think, believe majority of it will be a continuation of Biden's policies. I think the only caveat that I have really for that is that, in her acceptance speech, she really sort of honed in on being sort of a common sense candidate. And I think as it relates to oil and gas policy in the United States, we all know that there's an energy transition that's happening in the country, but obviously oil and natural gas still provide substantial amounts of supply to consumers, whether it's from, automobiles to just power load for the electric sector. So, she's truly going to be a common sense candidate. Maybe the energy transition that we're having here in the US can't exactly happen by year 2030 or 2040. It's probably a much longer transition as we pull away and bring more renewables online. You're going to be a common sense candidate. I think you have to some degree, realize the importance that oil and natural gas has to our economy for affordability and reliability as far as energy sources for consumers. So, I think that it'll be interesting to see if, should Harris get elected, will she just continue on the same track as the current Biden administration? Will she be more aggressive, or will she pull perhaps a little bit away from Biden and realize that the energy transition that we're having in this country might take a little longer, and oil and natural gas will be a much larger player than perhaps the progressives want to rely on in the future for this country. With that, I think one of the top issues, especially for the progressives, is the LNG pause. The Biden administration put the pause in place on January 26, 2024. And that was expected to last likely through the election. Many saw it as a sort of political play to appease the progressive Democratic base, allowing more liquefied natural gas to be exported for this country is seen by progressives as a way to continue a reliance on natural gas. And, trying to slow down any more LNG exports be one way to sort of curb our future dependence, at least as seen by the progressive movement. So, there's a court decision in the summer that ended the pause. I still think that we will see much daylight between now and then on when the Harris administration or potential Harris administration decides to, move forward on what to do about LNG exports. So, I definitely think that is something that a Harris administration could potentially either get more aggressive on and limit LNG exports moving forward, or potentially just continue on the same track as the Biden administration. All right, Jim, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that's right. But going beyond the LNG permit that takes a lot of headlines, reading between the lines of other policy positions that a Harris administration, might take include things like access to public lands and public waters. I think we all acknowledge that there's a limited authority that any president has on restricting domestic oil and gas production on private lands. There's certainly a host of regulatory initiatives that a Harris administration could do to thwart the robust drilling on private lands. But one thing is also clear is that any president has the ability to modify and restrict access to drilling and mining on public lands out west and in offshore waters, principally in the Gulf of Mexico. We've seen the offshore 5-year plan, which establishes over the next 5 years the number and frequency of offshore leases being scheduled for oil and gas purposes. Been a hot potato politically. The Biden administration restricted the number of new offshore lease sales to be the very minimum that is allowed by the Inflation Reduction Act, which imposed requirements to have at least one area-wide offshore oil and gas lease sale for every offshore wind lease sale. And we could certainly see a continuation of that restriction where there's anemic offshore oil and gas sales. The offshore wind industry has been up and down over the last few years with initially a lot of commercial interest in wind projects, particularly along the Atlantic coast. But we've seen that moderate, both just prices and commercially. Those projects are becoming less economic for a host of reasons. And so the desire of a Harris administration to have offshore wind sales and to hold their nose and have offshore oil and gas sales as required by the Inflation Reduction Act, that calculus may change if there's less interest in offshore wind. So conceivably, we could see, even a reduction in the number of offshore oil and gas sales and also a reduction in the number of acres that are made available on public lands for oil and gas activity. And not everyone and not many people read the party platforms, but if you read the Democrat platform that was put into place during the most recent convention, there's very aggressive language in that platform with respect to access, including banning, the word banning, all new oil and gas permitting on public lands and waters. So we could certainly see a continuation of the Biden policies, and we'd also see, a more aggressive restriction on access to public lands and public waters, just as we might see a more progressive view on the LNG ban list.
Yeah, I think that's right. And talk about the IRA. I mean, the offshore oil and gas industry and onshore oil and gas industry wouldn't likely have leases in future years without the IRA. Sort of the mandate that Senator Manchin and the other colleagues who voted for the legislation put in that legislation to ensure that there'd be continued development on federal lands here in the U.S. is pretty crucial, giving the industry some certainty on having a minimum of lease sales in the future. And it's interesting when we, read some things over the past couple of weeks about, what does the future of oil and gas policy in the United States look like? I can't remember who the article was by, but it essentially was talking about why presidents can't quit oil and gas in this country, and why there hasn't been sort of a more robust sort of, opportunity for Biden, who is all in on, moving to renewables and moving away from oil and gas, to really make some progress on that front. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that, right? The first is we generate a ton of federal revenue from oil and gas development in this country. It's anywhere from, $5 to $10 billion on average a year comes to the federal treasury from oil and gas royalties, rental rates, bonuses, et cetera. So there is a substantial amount of money that is derived from this activity that goes to the federal government. And that's just in, that form of revenue, not even scratching yet the, local taxes that are paid, the employment taxes that are paid, et cetera. So it is a pretty huge economic driver in this country. And if we didn't have domestic oil and gas production, it wouldn't just be a cost of the loss of those revenues, it'd be a cost of the loss of jobs and other things. So, I do think that it's hard as we transition away potentially from these resources to really ensure that nobody's left behind, if you will. In addition, there's demand. And we've talked about this a lot just in our own, interactions here in the office, that energy demand is continuing to rise. With every new gadget my teenagers put into the socket, whether it's their, new phone or what have you, that's an additional load that and demand load that has to be met. So I do think that there are some considerations for the importance of ensuring that our country has enough energy production to meet all of our demands, also in a affordable and reliable way. But I know we've talked a lot about the demand issues. What do you see sort of moving forward on that?
I think you're right to point out in Vice President Harris's acceptance speech, he talked a lot about being practical. And as you noted, any practical person would recognize that oil and gas are going to be a key part of the energy mix for, years, decades to come. Just about every day we read new demand forecasts and they all sort of scatter around, but they all coalesce on, a conclusion that we'll need oil and gas for many decades to come. And that demand overall, not just for oil and gas, but for all energy sources, is on the rise with things like, artificial intelligence and some of the power generation that's required to, power all these new technologies and devices. So that's certainly, one potential bookmark of a potential Harris administration. But again, the other, going back to will the real Kamala Harris please stand up? We also have to look at what the Biden administration has done and sort of look to continue some of those restrictions. And in addition to some of the issues that we talked about with LNG and restricting access potentially on public lands and offshore waters, I think we could see other regulatory burdens put on the industry. The Biden administration hasn't come out and had a press conference and say, we're done with oil and gas in the US. And there's a lot of reasons for that, including some of the practical issues that you've mentioned, Liz. But what we have seen is the Biden administration chip away and make more burdensome, make more difficult, lengthen the permitting time, make more expensive some of the oil and gas activities. And that's through use of existing rules and laws. Things like the endangered species will likely take a renewed front seat with respect to oil and gas activities. So for oil and gas on public lands in particular, there's things like the sage grouse and other endangered species that could, crop back into the conversation that could be limiting factors. We've seen it offshore with the Rice's whale in the Gulf of Mexico. There's been litigation this summer about that issue. I think we could see renewed interest in environmental restrictions on oil and gas operations, particularly in public lands and waters, but potentially elsewhere with respect to things like endangered species.
I think you're so right. And it's interesting because, I think we've seen personally many regulations that have come out of, whether it's Department of Interior or EPA or, what's moving forward with the Rice as well, biological opinion. I mean, all of these have the potential to have serious hits to the oil and gas industry. Other than maybe what's happening with the Rice as well, some of these regulations are so small that most Americans have no idea that, they're moving forward and their potential to restrict oil and gas development here in the United States. So, I think that the, potential Harris administration, she'll either continue to really lean into all of those regulations that the Biden administration has put forth and has been moving forward on, or there could be a potential to maybe, just let those regulations move forward and maybe take a pause on anything new, perhaps, pipeline regulations offshore or something onshore that will continue to impact the industry. One of those, obviously, specifically for onshore, is the methane fee or the methane waste fee from the IRA. That's moving forward. Obviously, that in combination with the methane regulation that is also coming forward from EPA, those are two huge pieces for the Biden administration in curbing oil and gas production and emissions on federal lands. So, I would foresee that the Harris administration, given how hard I think this Biden administration has worked to try and get those rules out the door as quickly as possible, that she would clearly continue with those and let those move forward, and we wouldn't see any pullback or restrictions on those. Obviously, the waste fee is derived from the IRA, so that would require Congress to take action to try and peel that piece of the IRA back. And Congress is another big item that we really haven't discussed yet. If Harris is elected, what the Harris administration is able to do could also depend on what her congressional counterparts look like, depending on who's in control of the House, who's in control of the Senate. She could be either dealing with a Congress that's supportive and helpful and helping the administration, get these measures moved along, or she could be dealing with a Congress that would like to see the IRA repealed. So I think we could definitely see some movement on what a Harris administration is able to do, depending on who's elected to Congress as well.
Yeah, that's undoubtedly true, really, for anyone who sits in the White House. But I think if we do see a Harris administration, regardless of what happens in either chamber on Capitol Hill, the Biden administration has operated with, a divided Congress for 3.5 years. And yet we've seen the Biden administration take many steps that the oil and gas industry has opposed. So a lot of these regulatory steps, which are not necessarily game changers reading the headlines, but make domestic oil and gas production more burdensome, more difficult, more expensive, more time consuming, et cetera. I think in any event, we will likely see that continue under a Harris administration. And I also think, what we'll see between now and November is potentially more details on, what a Kamala Harris administration would look like. We've seen very little said in the acceptance speech at the DNC about climate writ large, let alone oil and gas issues. We've seen reports of environmental groups being very supportive of a Harris administration and perhaps privately speculating that a Harris administration might be more anti-oil and gas and really develop some of the climate policies of the Biden administration in a much more robust way. But frankly, we don't know a lot of that yet. And the environmental groups have stated even publicly that their job is to get Harris elected and sort of details to be determined. And so, it'll be interesting to see over the coming months between now and the election whether Harris is, put on the record as to, what a Harris administration would mean, in particular oil and gas. But I think both of us would agree that it would likely be more of the same and potentially, more aggressive on some of the climate policies that were started in the Biden administration.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't think we'll see too wide of a departure from a Harris administration from what we've seen thus far in the Biden administration. Well, Jim, we have covered a lot of ground today. We hope everyone has enjoyed listening to Jim and I sort of banter back and forth about what we think a potential Harris administration will mean for the oil and gas industry. This is part of a mini series that Holland Knight is doing on the election. So hopefully you enjoyed this one, and please tune in to future On the Night podcasts. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Eyes on Washington podcast, brought to you by Holland Knight's Public Policy and Regulation Group. For more information on our Public Policy and Regulation Group, please visit hklaw.com/ppr.